Welcome, everybody. I am with Evan Jaqua. He is in Lima, Peru. I love this. The international political no-brainer podcast. Now we're making strides. So, and I really, that's one thing we've always talked about is going to Peru. We've been to, my wife's from Argentina and we've been to there, but Peru has always been, maybe next year. I don't know what we're doing this year, but once
Well,
a year.
yeah, it's definitely worth it. I mean, it's a spectacular combination of history. There are Inca ruins everywhere, incredibly interesting. And then the natural beauty. Once you see the Andes, your concept of a mountain will completely change when you see these 23,000 foot mountains. The Amazon rainforest actually starts in Peru, and then you've got some of the most mysterious and beautiful desert areas as well, and the coast too, up in north especially.
So I don't think my wife's actually finalized any vacation plans for this year. I might have to mention to her maybe we should consider Peru. That sounds exciting.
Oh, it
That's kind of
really is. It really is. I
it's
could
real right up our wheelhouse.
Yeah, I've spent most of the last 20 years here, and so I know it pretty well. I can give you lots of tips of off the beaten path things to do. And, there are lots of on the beaten path things to do, but I can give you a lot of tips where you might want to explore.
Oh, that sounds exciting. I may be I will be I will if not this year next year, but we'll be in touch the whole time. On and off over the next. We're now friends for life as far as I'm concerned.
Now
So
I'm looking forward to it.
So I am with Evan Jaqua, the Solutions Party. Are you the founder,
Yes.
the founder of the Solutions Party?
Mhm.
He's coming to us live from Lima, Peru, and he's got some great suggestions about solutions. Welcome to Political No Brainer, the podcast where we move past winner takes all politics and into real to real conversation. The first thing I see on his website is end reelection. And the first person I think of is Andrea Ocasio-Cortez and all the other House of Representatives. Our founding fathers intended for representatives to go to Washington for 2 years and then return home to their communities. And that obviously is not happening now. They have dug their feet in to the point where we see like Chuck Schumer is not, well, Mitch McConnell's in worse shape, but Mitch McConnell is literally held up by sticks for some meetings, and he stepped down from a leadership role, which I think was just obvious he would need to. We saw Joe Biden in a
Of
debate at
course.
9 p.m. at night, and the official response from the White House was after 9 o'clock he's spent. And I was like, well, we need a president that's really alert after 9 o'clock. He may even get woken up at 2 a.m. I'm not exactly sure what happens in that moment in time when he can't even put together a sentence at 9 p.m. But how do we end re-election? Let's start right there.
Okay. Well, the first thing that I like to talk about is I like to actually start the conversation with the human brain. The human brain is a great thing, but it has it has a number of weaknesses. Probably the biggest weakness of all is the ease with which it can form addictions. And, you can get addicted to drugs, you can get addicted to alcohol, you can get addicted to video games, you can get addicted to pornography, but probably by far the most addictive thing of all is power. Once people get power, they don't want to relinquish it, which is why, for example, Ron DeSantis wrote a very interesting article in the New York Times saying that our politicians are more interested in clinging to power than they are to serving the public. And this is what we've seen, not only, what we're seeing today, but we've seen it throughout history. Power is the most addictive thing there is. Now, if I were a doctor and I had to prescribe to you, Jeff, a highly prescriptive addictive medication, what would be the way to reduce the probability you're going to get addicted to it? Well, you give small doses spread apart. And that's exactly how political power has to be allocated. Now, when I say no reelection, I mean zero reelection, because the minute you get even one reelection in there, the re-election becomes the priority. Our politicians now spend over half their time raising funds for their next re-election campaign. They're in constant campaign mode. They spend money on taxpayers' money going to campaign events. And, frankly, if you hired me for a 2-year job or 4-year job, and I spent half my time just lobbying your organization to get an extension on my upcoming contract, I don't think you'd be too happy. You'd want me dedicated 100% of the time to my job. And that's exactly why we need to get rid of reelection. You get the message is this: you get one chance to make your mark on history. You get one chance to make a difference. What are you going to do with that chance? Are you going to do things selfishly? Are you going to just work for self-serving purposes? Or are you going to try to make a difference? So I think that the fundamental thing that we have to address is not only no reelection, but I even propose that we put a 2-year waiting period so that you can't use your present office as a springboard for your next upcoming election, like what we saw. I'll mention Ron DeSantis again. He was running for president while he was being governor of Florida. So a lot of the things he was doing, for Florida were actually more to help him prime the pump for his presidential campaign. So we want our politicians concentrating 100% of their time on their job and not obsessed with clinging to power like they are now. That's number one. Number two is we have to completely reform the idea of political parties. So that's why I say let's put a 16-year limit or 12-year limit on political parties. And I can go into that in a lot more detail if you'd like.
I would like that.
Yeah. The one thing I would want to say, though, is that if you go to solutionsparty.org under About, we have the draft constitution of the party. And the draft constitution makes it very clear that, we don't have to actually be an official political party. You just have to either, if you're going to be a candidate, you promise not to run for a re-election. You promise to serve only one term. You can run for another office 2 years after your term ends, but during your term in office, you can't. You promise not to run for re-election. You promise to not spend time raising funds for your next re-election because there is no re-election, and you promise to do lobbying only in power, to allow lobbyists to pitch to you only in public. But other than that, you don't have to support everything that's on the solutionsparty.org website. We actually encourage a diversity of opinions. Well, this is not, you either agree with us or you're out. We want a diversity of opinions, but we just want that fundamental. We put that one fundamental condition on anybody who wants to run for office. And we ask people to support candidates who promise to adhere to that.
And I just love that. There's one thing to unpack there, especially to me, is when you said politicians spend half their time raising money for their next reelection. I pretty much think they spend about 96% of their time hedging their bet for their next reelection. We've got not only Ron DeSantis, who showed what he could do as governor, now we've got Gavin Newsom doing the same thing as running for president, essentially, while being a sitting governor in California.
Exactly.
It just goes on and on and on and on. And the rule used to be it's best to be a candidate for a shorter period of time. And now the rule is it's best to be a candidate for apparently a longer period of time, as you like, because there are no rules anymore. So Gavin Newsom is literally using California taxpayers' money to run for president right now. I mean, he is making it clear unless something crazy happens and he just says, I'm not running, I'm pretty sure he's running.
Of course he is. And that's the thing. We've got, politics should never be about personalities. Politics should always be about ideas. We've got to get away from this idea of rock star politicians, And so anybody who says, well, I'm the only one who can solve our problems, anybody who says that, is frankly lying, because politics should never be about, personalities or people. It should be about ideas and vision. And so we want to get away from these career politicians is what it is, basically. And as you said, Gavin Newsom is just one example, but they all do it. They all use the power of their present office and the taxpayer money to advance their own political careers, to advance their own, personal ambition. And as long as our politicians are placing higher priority on their own political careers and on cleaning and expanding their own power, our problems are never going to be solved. And this is, by the way, across the political spectrum. We're not talking about, it's a problem of the left or it's a problem of the right. It's a problem that all people who get addicted to power have. And power, as I say, I think history shows very clearly, is the most addictive thing of all. In fact, the Lord of the Rings, the series of novels Lord of the Rings, is all really about how power and the addiction to power changes how people behave. They become different people. If you've ever known anybody with an addiction, it completely changes them. Why? Because the addiction becomes the priority.
The ultimate priority. And what's really, really interesting about that is they like, for example, first of all, the one thing you said is they run for office, they get elected, and then they can't do it for 2 more years. The one term, I love that. Just come and go. Just do 6 years as a senator, 2 years as a representative. Either way, and I also think we should give them the salary while they're out of work. Just we
Hmm.
squander so many taxpayer dollars. It really doesn't matter. The amount of money that would be paid out under your, frankly, really good idea and scenario wouldn't
Hmm.
matter if we paid them the salary while they're out of business. And the whole lot, they wouldn't be able to lobby if they're not really in office. A lot of lobbyists are not going to invest a lot of money in a person who's potentially going to get elected someday again. So they
Well,
would
yeah,
basically, but
yeah,
then
that's
comes, go
exactly
ahead.
right. You see, one of the ways you can control a person is by by controlling their addiction. Like, well, that's why drug pushers can control the addicts to whom they sell. And this is what happens. Our special interests take advantage of our politicians' addiction to power. And what do? Well, they contribute directly to their campaign. They contribute to the political action committees. And they try to, the holy grail of any industry group, special industry or special interest group, is to create a culture war where, well, what is a culture war? It's when our disagreements go tribal, and then there's no reason. It's all pure emotions. And so, an industry group, the holy grail is to create a culture war by which their business model or their interests become one side of the culture war, which is one of the reasons why we have these terrible culture wars. So we've always had disagreements, but they've gone ultra tribal, and that's a terrible thing because tribalism and democracy don't mix. Democracy should be a competition of ideas, not an emotional, vicious tribal warfare that we're seeing now. And so the thing is that the special interests, they love to have career politicians because they can control them over the long term. But if you only have people who are only going to be there serving one term, it's going to be a lot harder for the special interests to influence because they can't dangle that, we'll help you get reelected, carrot out there.
Right. And when you talk about tribal is basically the foundation of tribal is the ideologue. So you create the tribe, you create the ideologue, then you've got this person, this chief in charge of it all. And if you were just to cut his legs off at 2 years or cut his legs off at 6 years, you got to start over. And and
Exactly.
and we really need to get to that point. So I brought up Gavin Newsom, right? Okay, so
Right.
in California, Gavin Newsom termed out. Okay, so now you've literally got, and I interviewed one of them yesterday. His name was Thunder Parley. He is running for the Democrat nomination for governor. There's
Mhm.
60 people running for the Democrat nomination for governor. The only
Mhm.
one the Democrats take, according to him, one of the only ones the Democrats are taking serious is the one that's sitting in office right now. He's going to lateral from one position to the governor's office
Mhm.
because we
Mhm.
continue this ideologue, we continue this tribal vision, this tribal sense.
Right.
And that's what's going to happen in California. So the Democrats, and then he said, all I wanted to do is speak at this one engagement. And they told me, in order to speak at this one engagement, I would have to have $1 million in my campaign fund. And it's like, it's just a little, give him 5 minutes. But this
Right.
is the problem we have. You got to have $1 million in your account. So even if you had the $1 million and you transferred it over to the account, you can't take it back. According to
Right.
federal campaign fund laws, it's there and probably will wind up in the hands of the Democratic Party because if you're not really if you don't really have a good structure, you're not going to be able to spend $1 million on the campaign. So,
Right.
and it's just funny how, I've never heard the suggestion before, but if it's just one term, a lot of these 60 people would be more considered because
Sure.
they're all coming from outside, a lot of them,
Right.
including Thunder Parley, who's never
Mhm.
been in politics before. And
Mhm.
and so and then you say, well, he has no experience. Well, neither did Arnold Schwarzenegger when he became
Well,
governor
Donald
of
Trump.
California,
Either did
or
Donald Trump.
Donald Trump, or
Yes.
frankly, I mean, Ronald Reagan was an actor before he got into politics. I mean, we can go
Right.
down the list.
Well, yeah, I think it's very important, when people say, well, one of the advantages of no term limits is that you get this experience. But you got to ask yourself, what are our politicians experienced at? Well, they're experienced at being politicians. That's what they're experienced at. They're experienced at spending half their time raising funds. They're experienced at giving non-answers. If you ever, whenever a career politician is interviewed now, they either, if they get to ask a tough question, they either don't answer the question or they give an incredibly, vague response, so that they're experienced at being hyper partisan. And this is the sort of experience we don't want anymore. Let's have people with fresh ideas get in there who are going to, work to advance those ideas, period. Nothing more.
I'm actually, so this is my thing now. I'm never gonna run for office again. I'm never gonna run for office again. I did it. It was awful. I remember my 5-year-old called me and asked me, "When are you coming home?" And I
Uh-huh.
was like, "I'm coming home right now." And we're gonna
Uh-huh.
draw and we're gonna watch TV, and I put the whole
Hmm.
nightmare behind me, really. And it
Hmm.
wasn't. It was just a terrible experience. Not because meeting the people in the community was wonderful. Meeting the Democratic leaders, I was running as a Democrat, was just awful. And it was just ridiculous. Everything was about money, everything. And then when I just put it out there, I said, I'm not into raising money. I'm into raising awareness. Then I was just an idiot. And
Right.
then so I started the podcast where I raise awareness. That's all I do. I talk to guys like you. And I
Right.
talk to so many great people who have great ideas, right? But the fact of the matter is that when you get to know, it's not just the people that are in office, it's the people behind the scenes in the Democratic Party
Of
leadership and all.
course. Of
They never
course.
leave those positions either.
Of
And
course.
they hold the little puppet strings like this, and America's getting nowhere. And like you said, when you talk about tribal, we've gone on down this rabbit hole for many, many years when there was Joe Biden and Ted Kennedy and John McCain finagling deals in the Senate together. I'm a Democrat, I'm a Republican, but we can have a conversation. Yeah, every deal they finagled, they cannibalized the Social Security fund, they cannibalized the post office fund, they squandered all kinds of billions on all kinds of crap. So all the deals they made as a partnership of two parties really just ultimately screwed the American people too. So it would have been better if none of those three that I just named and many more never got reelected. Just start from scratch every 6 years.
Exactly. Where, the first consideration is not what do I have to do to get reelected or what do I have to do to advance our party interests. You see, George Washington, he warned against political parties. And we were seeing that, that very obvious, where the priority of the political parties is to advance their own power. It's not working in the interest of the people. And so that's why what I've proposed is that let's disband the major parties. Let's put a 12-year limit or a 16-year limit on any new political party. In other words, political parties can serve as a useful vehicle for people of like ideas, similar ideas, to organize and present candidates and bills accordingly. But you don't want the political parties to become tribalized like what we have now, because any organization, as the famous historian Carol Quigley said, organizations tend to become institutionalized, which that means is that the interests of the organizations start taking priority. And that's exactly what we have now. We're seeing a vicious tribal warfare between, one side and the other. And it's not for the benefit of the people. They're both working to expand viciously to expand their own power, which is what political parties always do. An example, a real clear example is let's take the Communist Party, which originally was set up to enable and empower workers. And what has it become? A corrupt, criminal, religious, cult-like organization that serves the party bosses. And they brutally subject their citizens. They brutally subject entire groups of countries, all for the benefit of the party bosses. And this is, while it might not be that extreme with our two political parties, it's basically the same illness. They're basically obsessed with their own power, with increasing their own power. And that's the first priority. And you, having run as a Democrat and having seen the Democratic Party, you probably have a lot more, visibility into that
You
than,
see,
than I
it's all.
do.
It's first of all, you can't even have your own vision. First of all, I ran as a Democrat. I said I like the ACA. I've never thought it should be called the Affordable Care Act. I thought it should be called the Available Care Act. It made
Right.
care available to people.
Of
It's
course.
not always affordable, but if God forbid you get diagnosed with an awful brain tumor, you pay the same rate as the next guy who's perfectly healthy. At least you can then make a deal and have
Right.
coverage. And it's
Right.
good for America. There are some things that need to be fixed, but we are on, like you said, the tribal vision of both sides. Both sides want to decimate the ACA for one reason or another.
Mm.
Republicans hate it because it gives employees the leeway of just jumping from job to job or starting a small business or becoming a
Right.
drummer or a guitarist in a band. And then you've got Democrats who just want universal health care. So again, it's this tribal vision of why we got to get rid of these things. The vision doesn't serve the people. The bickering over what the policy is doesn't serve the people. Resolving the issues with the one policy in place would serve the people better.
Right. Well, we're talking about the ACA. That was originally proposed by the Heritage Foundation. And then a Republican Senator, John Chafee, proposed something very similar, what the ACA has, in other words, providing health insurance through, things like, through the private industry. And the fact of the matter is that if this had been promoted by a Republican president, the Republican Party would be completely behind it, and the Democrats would be completely opposed to it.
Right.
That's the crazy thing. Or let's, to deviate a little bit, let's talk about impeachment. If Bill Clinton had been Republican, the Republicans would have defended him tooth and nail, and the Democrats would have impeached him, as opposed to the vice versa. And the same thing with Trump. And so, one of the things that one of the tragedies of this is that in the vicious pursuit of power, truth and principles become completely expendable. That's why our politicians, lie with reckless abandon, just like an alcoholic will lie, to get that drink. The truth means nothing to them because the priority is getting the drink. And the same thing with politicians who are obsessed with getting power. Truth and principles have no bearing at all. And when I mean principles, what I mean by this is it's very simple. You just need to ask yourself, if you just switch the names of the people and the parties, would your opinion completely change about it? The same transgression, let's say, but you just switch the names. It's like back in the Jim Crow era. If a white man assaulted a black woman, well, that's just boys being boys, boys having some fun. But if a black man assaulted a white woman or looked at a white woman in the wrong way, then that becomes, time for lynching. The exact same crime, you just switch the characteristics of the perpetrator and the victim, and suddenly something goes from being, no big deal to being a horrific crime. And that is what we call lack of principle. That means, where you're applying different standards depending on the characteristics. You're not focusing on the transgression that was committed. And that's what our political parties are now, is where, what they do now is that, if Joe Biden does something, the Republicans, if he were to do something like start his own, I don't know, a cell phone company, the Republicans would have said it was absolutely, corrupt, and they'd be right. But Trump does it, and it's like see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. They don't say anything. And
Well,
so,
go
please,
ahead.
please.
No,
Well, I was
go
going to
ahead.
say, it's double these incredible and terrible double standards that our politicians have. There is no principle anymore. It's basically, if my guy does it, it's okay. If their guy does it, it's absolutely unacceptable. And that's not how it should operate. We should have like the same principle of equality under the law. Equality under the law means you focus on the transgression committed, not on the characteristics of the people who committed it or the characteristics of the victims. You focus on the transgression. And that's exactly how our politicians should operate. They have to ask themselves, okay, if I take party out of it, how would I feel about this? And they speak, truthfully. They don't switch their opinion on something based on which party we're talking about.
Right. So when you think about those hypocrisies, or for example, I remember listening to Donald Trump's State of the Union address, and he talked about how President Trump talked about how he secured trillions of dollars in investment from foreign countries into America. And I always joke, I still haven't seen one small project yet of these trillions of dollars. I haven't seen
Right.
one brick laid yet. Where are these trillions of dollars? And he was this salesman. He came from New York as a developer, telling people my buildings are beautiful and occupied, and then Okay, but Bill Clinton, when he left office, he was espousing that he's leaving America with trillions of dollars in surpluses. And
Right.
then
Yes.
30 days into the next presidency, we have an economic crisis. So the revenue projections went from these trillions of dollars in surpluses into these trillions of dollars in deficits. But Bill Clinton left as an economic champion because he left us with trillions of dollars in surpluses. So you see this on both sides. You see this
You
nonsense
do.
when we talk about anything that's going on today. I mean, I didn't agree with going and getting the guy from Venezuela, but Bush went and got it from Noriega. Reagan invested Grenada. I mean,
Right.
on and on the list goes. And then,
Right.
you just argue the point. If you want to hold either party accountable, hold them both accountable. We have been a country at one war after another for the last 50 years, under whatever leadership it very well may be. The only president that ever didn't really fire a shot was Jimmy Carter, and the only president that ever pulled us out of a war was Joe Biden. So
Mhm.
the rest of the matter is that we keep talking about our side being more beneficial. They keep talking about their side being more beneficial. It's all the same crap. And they're
Right.
all leading us down the same rabbit hole, and they're all grabbing the keys to the family car and driving in the same ditch. So
Right.
how do we get to that point?
Well, again, I think the first step, number one, is getting rid of the whole notion of reelection, and not only that, as I say, you can't even run for another office while you're currently serving. Getting rid of our the whole notion of our conventional notion of political parties. Political parties will be temporary vehicles under which people can organize that, but after a certain period, the political party will be disbanded. That should help address the tribalism. And by the way, new political parties cannot be led by previous leaders of the political parties that have been disbanded. Now, some people will say, well, won't the new political parties just be carbon copies of the old ones? I say, I don't think that's going to happen, because what people who are trying to start a new political party are just going to say, well, we want to be exactly like the last guys. They're going to want to present new ideas, ideas that get people excited. And so getting rid of the whole notion of political parties, I think, will make anything. The other thing is addressing our journalism. Our journalism is in terrible shape, and that's why one of the things is politicians love it when they can control the narrative. And because of the sorry state of our journalism, politicians are now controlling the narrative. If there's an article they don't like, they can just say, well, that's fake news. If they lie, you know, there's no credible source anymore to call them out on that lie. Some of these favorite, let's say, friendlier news stations will not call out the lie, and others will, but nobody really knows what the truth is anymore, which is why I propose reforming our journalism. Because if you believe that the pen is mightier than the sword, which I do, then our journalism, the robustness of our journalism, has to be a national security priority, at least as important as our national defense, because our journalism protects us from enemies from both within and without. Our military protects us from enemies from without. But we need to refocus on making our journalism great again, and I tried to offer some proposals for that. And the other thing is holding our politicians accountable for lying. For example, if somebody lies, they have every right to lie during a job interview, but that prospective employer has every right to kick them out of the interview if they're caught lying. If somebody lies on the job, the employer has every right to fire that employee. And that's exactly the same standard we have to have when it comes to people running for office, because when politicians lie, either candidates or people who have been elected lie, they're gumming up our democracy, because the electorate cannot make wise choices, good choices, if they don't know what the truth is, if they don't know what is real and what is not. And that's why we have to have a system in place to call out our politicians when they lie, and if they don't improve, if they keep lying, that they become disqualified for running. And if a politician lies, just like what was that guy George, the one from Santos, he is so blatantly lying that he was actually kicked out of Congress. Well, that's exactly has to happen whenever our politicians lie. If they continue to lie, they should be kicked out of office, because that is they are violating the sacred duty of democracy, which is to be truthful with the voters. Because if the voters don't know the truth, they can't make wise and correct decisions.
Yeah, and that's really first of all, I always say when you talk about the media and where we lost the media or we lost control of the media or whoever took control of the media, I always equate that with the Vietnam War. I've always
Hmm.
told people, and I strongly believe the reason the Vietnam War was so unpopular is because the first time war was televised. And I
Right.
think everybody learned from that you can't just have a camera on napalm hitting little babies and expect the war to have a favorable image of it. So
Right.
then you got to the Iraq War where bombs are going down these chimneys exactly where they're supposed to be sailing,
Right.
taking out the building they're supposed to be taking
Right.
out. But nobody's talking about the brick that sailed off and hit an old lady in the head across the street.
Right.
So that's where they got the idea that we've got to control the media. We've got to control the narrative. And now they have full control of the narrative. And now they've decided not just to have full control of the narrative. So allegedly, the Democrats have full control of NBC, and the Republicans have full control of Fox. And we have lost any sort of worthwhile reporting. And
Exactly.
and
Yeah.
go ahead.
The thing is, back in the old days, it was not easy to set up a news organization. Whether you're talking about a newspaper, you had to have a printing presses, you had to have reporters, you had to have an advertising department, you had a way to distribute the newspapers. It was a huge investment. Or a television network, a news network, or radio. That all used to require a lot of investment. But now, any guy with a laptop and a website can start a quote unquote news site. And so the conventional business model of news has collapsed because news is basically, free now. And so what has happened is that our news organizations have turned away from actually presenting an honest view of the fact, and they become more like political infotainment channels where their purpose is to manipulate the emotions. They become emotion manipulating political infotainment channels. And and so they do what they have to get people to come back. As one of the author of, I think it was Hypocrisy, it was written by a former Fox News host. He said that the priority was coming up every day with articles or were stories that would manipulate people's emotions, get them getting that rush of rage, and because that rush of rage actually is addictive in itself. And so our news, quote unquote, news organizations are basically becoming emotion manipulating political infotainment channels that just try to leverage the addictions, the addictive emotions that their viewers have. And so that's why we have to have what I have proposed. You actually certify journalists and news organizations. You have a whole set of criteria to evaluate them, and if they're just going to be political infotainment channels, they're not going to be certified. They've got to present a range of views, and they've got to do so in a factually accurate way. And we have, by the way, proposed what I call a national press fund to support smaller journalism, because one of the great tragedies of what has happened of journalism is that small town journalism has died, and small town journalism is absolutely critical to keeping corruption in check in smaller communities that don't have the audience size of a place like LA or New York. And so these are some proposals to help bring back journalism, make it what it should be, reporting facts to people. We have to understand that the traditional business model of news it just doesn't work anymore in the age of the internet. And so we have to think of it as a national resource that has to be supported through not only a government. The fund, the National Press Fund I'm proposing, is something government contribute to, individual contribute to, corporations contribute to, because you don't want the money that supports our journalism to be tied to one particular entity, be it the government or be it a particular corporation or be it some rich individual like we have with the Washington Post. I doubt,
Well,
the Washington.
when you say that,
Yeah.
no one realizes, but Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett company, has been buying up newspapers all across the country for years. And it's funny because he accrued I don't know how many newspapers, and it never really turned to be profitable for him, but he still has them. He's never sold them. He's never closed them. And he recently turned them over to a management company. It's called Lee Publishing or something.
Hmm.
But he still has all this ownership of all these local newspapers. And when you just brought that point of how they've kind of consolidated the news industry, and we need to get back to the actual independent news, which is essentially I consider like my podcast an independent news. We don't really we I hear the stories and I hear the information and I hear all the facts and then I say let's really break it down to something like wisdom. Because
Mhm.
what everybody's doing now is smashing the facts in your face and saying this is the way you're supposed to see it. And frankly, that's
Mhm.
not necessarily the way you're supposed to see it.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Again, people don't know what to believe anymore. There's so much, misinformation out there, and that's why it's absolutely crucial. And oh, by the way, this misinformation is not only from within; it's from without. We have all sorts of, on X, for example, all sorts of foreign trolls who are going and spreading misinformation, and we've got to have a commonly agreed upon set of facts that we can all agree on, and then based on that we can make decisions, ideas based on those facts. People have different proposals how to address the different problems. Well, we've got to agree on what the problems are first.
Yeah,
and
at least start with a list of problems and then
yeah, yes, and we have to have facts that we all agree upon. For example, let's talk about climate change. Is climate change really a problem or not? Now, I think that, personally, I believe that it is. But, there are a lot of people who don't. Okay, well, let's get, if we have robust journalism where the facts are presented in an objective way, then people can make decisions based on those facts, not based on misinformation that's been churned out by one interest group or the other. So that's why we need to have, that's another thing that I've tried to address is the problem of our journalism in our country, because without robust journalism, without robust fact checking, the politicians and the special interest groups are going to control the narrative, which is exactly what we have now. Again, nobody knows what the truth is. And if nobody knows what the truth is, then politicians will take advantage of that to control the narrative and tell people what they say is the truth. I mean, even President Trump, he said, come to me for the truth. I mean, there's a reason why he calls his
so
platform Truth Social. That's the Russia, in the Soviet Union, their paper was simply called Pravda, which means truth.
right. He
and
probably
that
got
and
a
that,
tip from Putin to call it true social too. No, I'm just
yeah.
kidding. No,
And
imagine
so
that
we
being
want to have, we need to set up a system which makes our journalism great again, making journalism great again, making it robust again, making it something that people can believe in again. Back in the old day when Walter Cronkite said, and that's the way it is, people believed it. And so we want to get back to an era where people have faith that our news organizations aren't just propaganda channels for one political group or the other.
well, and I think that people really do actually don't have that faith any longer. I think they really do believe that what we have now is propaganda machines for both sides
Oh,
accordingly.
exactly. That's exactly what they think. And they don't know what to believe anymore. And that's why I think addressing journalism, and I've tried to make some proposals to address that, is absolutely crucial. Because without robust journalism, without, if our electorate doesn't have a common set of facts that we can agree on, then we can't have meaningful debates. And if we can't have meaningful debates, we can't move forward on any ideas. The thing about our democracy is a competition of ideas, and that's what it should be, an honest competition of ideas. And once we get to a point where our country is really engaged in an honest competition of ideas is when we will start really making progress. The autocracies like China and Russia, we are far stronger precisely because of the diversity of our ideas, precisely because of the competition of our ideas. And what we need to have is to make it an honest, fact-based competition of ideas instead of what we have now, which nobody knows, what to believe anymore. And we have flooded with misinformation and lies and politicians whose first priority is, staying in office and expanding their own power, and political parties who are, who are just mindlessly tribal.
And in the next few weeks, I'm going to be releasing my plan for America. Not really
Perfect.
candidacy at all. Actually, not a candidacy. It's going to have a party name too. And I'm going to be inviting people back to talk about it, to rip it apart or say I like this or I hate that, but it does exactly what you just said. It just identifies a list, a starting point. And I think it's
Right.
essentially 6 or 7 really vital issues that we
Hmm.
have been ripping at both sides apart and tearing at each other's throats apart. And it says, let's just bring down the political temperature a little bit, and let's talk about mitigate. Let's just talk about simple solutions at the moment. And it's going to be released. I've already done my share, and Laura, my partner, she's going to do what she does best, is just make it beautiful. Because I can, it's kind of like I say, if I paint the kid's room, you'll know I painted it. If I have a professional paint it, you'll know a professional painted it.
Hmm.
Well, I did my part, and it looks like I painted the kid's room. But when she's done touching it up, it's going to look great. And then we're going to put it out there on our website, politicalnobrainer.com, and we're going to talk about it to every candidate. We're going to suggest that you go through it before you come on the podcast and see what you think. Because we are at a point now where not only are the parties tribal, but it used to be the Democrats always had a whole host of priorities. That was basically what I remember. Robert Gates, who was the defense secretary for Obama, who's the defense secretary for Bush, and Obama asked him to stay on, and he was just perceived as this great Washington leader, this great
Right.
Washington thinker. And when he left office and he did his exit interview, he talked about all the presidents he worked for. Strangely enough, really the only president he didn't work for in the whole bunch was Clinton. But anyway, he worked for most of them. And he talked about how Jimmy Carter was a good president, but he had too many priorities.
Hmm.
And I said that's the Democratic Party's problem. They just got 100 priorities. Well, the Republican Party used to really have 3 signature items. I always said it was the military, business, and the economy.
Hmm.
And they kept it fairly simple, and that's why more people could relate to that party, whereas than people could relate to that. Now the Republicans have like a whole 111 priorities too. DEI is at the top of that list, and nobody really knows what the hell that is, other than
Right.
Trump hates it. And now
Right.
everybody hates it. And it's like, do you realize a lot of it is like bike racks on the front of public transportation? That's
Right.
DEI. Do you realize
Right.
that any part of what DEI really is? Because Trump keeps equating it with homosexuality. And I'm like, it really has nothing to do with homosexuality. But he's
Right.
convinced people. And I've always said, I've come to the conclusion, I shouldn't say this, but I will, that being a podcaster and just getting to know a lot of people, all homophobes in my are probably homosexuals.
Hmm.
Because they just have this giant issue with something that either doesn't pertain to them or really does pertain to them. And
Right.
so,
Right.
but that's how DEI just got tore apart. It's like, do you realize it has to do with maybe a Spanish speaking teacher being able to relate to a newly enrolled Spanish student that's just learning English? That's a part of
Right.
DEI. Is that okay if we do that? Do we not
Right.
just
Well,
throw the
yeah.
child into a classroom? So I've just said, that's the problem today is when we talk about tribal, when we talk about dismantling parties, the Republican Party used to have it more together, 3, 4 things they focused on, whereas the Democrats always had a list of 174 things they focused on. But
Hmm.
it would be nice to just dismantle both parties and let the people say, hey, what can we really focus on for the next 6 months?
Right. Yeah. That's why I say, what I propose is that we disband political parties after a certain period of time. New political parties can show up, but there'll only be 2 or 3 government recognized parties. What I mean by that is the ones that have sufficient number of members to actually, be put on the ballot. Because what we don't want to have is 1,500 different political parties. You want to have people of different points of view coalesce under 2 or 3 big tents. Like I actually lived in Japan many years, and one of the problems is they had one big political party, and they had about like 30 different smaller political parties, and they couldn't get to organize. So the big political party pretty much monopolized power for decade after decade after decade. And we don't want that. We want to have 2 or 3 parties under which people coalesce, and then have a fair competition of ideas. And by the way, I'm looking really forward to seeing your
Oh, you're
website.
gonna you're gonna get it first. You're gonna be one of the first to get it because I want to do the interview again, and I want to see what you think
Yeah.
about it because
Oh,
it's
yes.
because we really need to let's just focus on 5 or 6 things. Let's get over the whole idea of we've literally got a hole in the White House, a giant missing part of the building, And
Right.
that's the big discussion now, is are we even going to complete the construction? And it's like, how does that work? Like, is that side of the building flooding when it rains? I mean, that's our
Right.
newest focus now, and it's like, can we
Right.
just get to some list of some things we just want to accomplish?
Well, yeah, but the thing is that everything has become a culture war issue now. It's like, okay, are you for the ballroom or are you against it? And that defines, or are you going to call it Gulf of Mexico or Gulf of America?
Right.
These little these insignificant things that people have turned into this tribal warfare crap. It's another battle in the culture war, and it's just so ridiculous. It's so unproductive. And so, yeah, I'm really looking forward. But one thing I wanted to say was, I actually went to a small liberal college, liberal arts college, and it was, liberal in every sense of the word. And I was a young Republican. I just voted for Proposition 13 in California. I was pro-capitalist, anti-Soviet. And I got into a lot of emotionally charged discussions with my fellow students. But I can tell you this, is that after all the intense debating, after all the heated arguing, and after all the points and counterpoints that have been made, we could still go and have lunch together, or go have coffee together, or study together, laugh together. Because even though we disagreed, vigorously, we all knew that the other people, the other persons were good people, had the best of intentions. They just had different ideas, and we need to get back to that. We got to stop demonizing other people because they have different points of view. Let's hear their points of view. Let's consider them. Let's learn from them. And let's get this rancor and this anger and just downright hatred out of it. Let's focus on the ideas. Let's focus on the facts, and let's move things forward.
I agree, Evan Jaqua. You have an incredible organization, the Solutions Party. I'm going to get that document out. That's going to be out soon. It's going to be on my website. I'm going to email you to just click on it, read the whole thing, and let's go over it together. This
Oh, I can
covers a
hardly
lot.
wait. I can
Yeah,
hardly wait.
and
That'll be
I'm
so much
looking forward to
fun.
having that conversation, because this has been a great conversation, and I want to continue it. And I always say I'm always going to invite my guests back for further conversation, because we got a lot to do. One of the things you had mentioned is the whole how we've basically, I don't know, not necessarily corrupted, but we've destroyed our ability to report because
Right.
of what's going on now. And I want to get back to the basics of reporting. Let's just get realistic on
Yes.
that subject too.
Yeah. Yeah, that's why what I've proposed is that we certify our journalists, but we also give them a grade. And so, like, you can think of the certification like your degree from college, the document that says you've graduated. And you can think of the grade as like your transcript. And so you'll be graded on things like, well, how well written are the articles, how relevant are the articles, how well fact checked are those articles, and a host of things. And you would have like a Rotten Tomatoes way of evaluating. It's not going to be just one organization. You could have AI evaluating the programs. You could have professional evaluators, and they get a grade. And if their grade falls below a certain level, they would be warned that they would be, potentially decertified as a journalist. And if you're certified as a journalist, then you qualify for a stipend every month from this National Press Fund. That would go to supporting, smaller journalists who aren't going to make a lot of money, in their markets, in their smaller market, but who play a crucial role at the local level in smaller rural markets, for example, or smaller suburban markets, because we want to have, local journalism made robust again. And we want to have our national journalism be trustworthy again. And so that's why I think we have to have certification plus a grading system. And that grading system would be a multifaceted one. So it's not just dependent on one fact checker, for example.
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. I think it's going to take time to get implemented, but I think the American people are ready to embrace some big things. I think the one thing they like about Trump is he's the guy that swings the bat harder than anybody. I just don't like where he's swinging the bat at. But the fact of the matter is, at least he's not the guy that's doing the same old thing over and over again. But I love the idea. I think America's ready to embrace some of these new ideas. Really, really ready to take on some new approaches.
Yeah, I think Americans, starting with me, are just
And
absolutely
me.
sickened. Yeah, I was sickened with what they're seeing now. The lack of progress, the stupid bickering, the lies, the misinformation, the vicious struggle over power instead of concentrating on really moving our country forward, this giving special interest groups the priority over the general interests of the people. And, I think Americans are sick of this, and I think Americans are really ready for a change. And so I'm actually, as I said, in Peru, but I've been most here the last 20 years in Peru, but I'm moving back to the U.S. And starting in June, I plan to dedicate a lot more time to moving this forward. I hope to start a podcast. You'll be one of my first guests.
That would be great. I would love that. You need to jump right on
Yeah.
that when you get back, or even before. Really, I do it remotely. I mean, we're gonna go on vacation. I'm taking a laptop and a microphone, and I'm ready to go again. So,
Oh, that'd be great. I've been doing business here for many years, and so I've got some business things I got to dedicate some time to while I'm here. But once I get that out of the way during this trip, I'm going to really start dedicating some serious time to this. And again, this isn't about me. This is about ideas. And if somebody can promote these ideas better and move them forward better than I, let he or she step forward, I'll gladly give them the reins. This is not about any sort of personality, ego trip. This is about moving things forward.
I'm 100% with you. Like, my plan for America has nothing to do with me being a candidate. So my first step is to get it out there. And my second step is to discuss it with so many great guests like yourself. And if there's some real feeling for it, anybody can take it and run with it. It doesn't
Exactly.
cost royalties. You don't have to give me the
Right.
credit. I'm nearly 60 years old. I'm done with the egos and the credit I'm just, if we can make something better, and I can contribute to that, let's try that on for size.
Exactly. This isn't about, like I say, politics should never be about personalities. It should be about, or people. They should be about ideas and vision. And let's put the ideas and the vision on the pedestal. Let's never put any politician or any candidate on a pedestal, because that's not the point. The point is, what are the ideas? And the other thing I just want to say about no reelection, the thing is if you like the current candidate, but they're not eligible they're only going to be there for one term. Well, if you want, if you can't reelect them, then vote for somebody who promises to carry on and hopefully improve on those ideas. Should never be about one person. It has to be about the ideas, and voting for people that you believe can help advance those ideas.
Right. I mean, it's in business too. I remember in a particular business, they wanted to hire a particular person to run the whole thing. And that person said, I'm happy where I'm at. And they said, okay, well, come sit with us. Let's talk to you. Let's get to know you. And we'll hire somebody similar to you. Let's do an
Right.
interview. Let's get to know how you do things. And she said, okay. I mean, they
Right.
paid her for it, but I mean, they paid her travel. They paid her time, but they really liked the way the operation was running. They just didn't know how she got it to run so smooth. So they said, well, let's sit down and talk to you about it.
Right.
We just want to get to know you, and we'll hire somebody that interviews just like you would have. And so you can do
Exactly.
that with any politician. There's no need to think for 1 minute that the only guy that could do what Joe Biden did was Joe Biden, because I can tell you for a fact, the only guy many people could have accomplished what Joe Biden accomplished. But
Right.
but
Yeah, it's really too bad. He drank the Kool-Aid, and
he
he
got
should
swallowed
never.
up by power.
Yeah,
He got
and
addicted to power. It was just like you
exactly,
said.
exactly.
He said
He
he's going to
drank the
pass the
Kool-Aid.
torch, pass the freaking torch. And the funny
Exactly.
thing was, he not only did the power, but it went to his head that he did well in the midterms. And it's like, Joe, it has nothing to do with you, these midterm results.
Right.
So
Right.
stop thinking you're going to get
Yeah.
reelected on the premise that if you look at the reelection numbers, you're going to have the same numbers in the general election, because all it really had to do with was the emotion of abortion being removed from a right. It had
Right.
nothing to do with
Right.
Joe Biden, but he
Yeah.
had to run again.
He had to run
And
again.
Kamala Harris had this idea again, the addiction to power. If I don't say anything, I listen to her sometimes in the interviews. She says, "It's not that I'm surprised; it's the capitulation." And it's like, honey, you're a capitulator. When we needed a
Right.
leader, we got a follower. When we needed a
Yeah.
candidate, we got a person that only knew how to raise $1 billion and spend money on Facebook snippets. And
Well,
it was like,
yeah. Well, yeah, she said that she thought that the decision for him to run for re-election was reckless. Well, if she thought it was reckless, then she should
she
have
should have
resigned.
said something.
She should have, yeah, she said, look, I can't support this. And so I think it's best for me to resign, and I won't run for office, but I just can't agree with you running for it. She should have said something. She thought it was reckless.
Absolutely,
And
she was the first person. She's the person side by side with him for that 4 years. If I'm
right.
sitting next to a partner that's literally, I'm saying, "Hey, what do you think?" and he's going, "I'm gonna be really concerned. He's my partner."
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's not good.
It was like, he had to go into that debate. He had to decisively show that age was not a factor, and he decisively showed the opposite,
He showed
and
that in his age, especially in his condition, was very much the factor, and Trump came out like on steroids, showing I'm
yeah.
okay.
Well, the thing is that Trump actually, I don't think he did a good job at all. I think he would have gotten torn apart by a real somebody who had but in comparison to somebody who was just a bumbling, babbling old man, yeah, he came out looking great. Even though if you look at what he was saying, it was by no means, a champion debate performance by
No,
any
not at
means.
all, not at all. But like you said, the fact of the matter is, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris should have said, she should have came right out in front and said he is not fit to run again. Whether this cost me my entire political career, which it did, or
Mhm.
not, I have to let the American people know the truth, which she did not.
Exactly. Exactly. And so, Joe Biden could have gone down as a historic president if he had not drank the Kool-Aid and if he really stayed to his commitment to be a one-term president and passed the torch on to some others. But that all aside, the basic problem is what we've been talking about, the tribalization of our parties, our candidates whose first priority is staying in office. And until we address that, if we're talking about Republicans or Democrats, it's like talking about blue curtains or red curtains on the Titanic. It's just, unless we address the fundamental problems that this probably faces, and it all comes down, I believe, to our politicians and our political parties. It's not the fault of the Democrats, not the fault of the Republicans, it's not the fault of the liberals, it's not the fault of the conservatives, not the fault of the illegal immigrants. It all comes down to our elected politicians, because they are the ones in whom we entrust the sacred power of the people, and they're using that power for their own benefit and not for the benefit of the people. And as long as that's the case, we cannot expect things to improve. We have to address this fundamental flaw in our democracy that is really causing this country the problems, the ever worsening problems that we're facing.
Absolutely. And that was an incredible way to wind it up, Evan. That was really great. I'm looking forward to another podcast with you, and it'll
I
be
can
soon.
hardly wait. I can hardly wait.
Thank you,
And
sir.
please send me that. I
I
can
am.
hardly wait
That's
to
how
see that.
we're gonna kick it off with that for
Perfect.
sure. It won't be long. I know it won't be long. I'm waiting on
Excellent.
it. And thank you, Evan Jaqua with the Solutions Party, and he's got some incredible solutions. This is Political No Brainer, the podcast where we move past winner takes all politics and into real solutions. And today we got to have a great conversation with the Solutions Party. Thank you so much, Evan.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Jeff. I can hardly wait till next time.
I can't wait either. This was incredible. Thank you, sir. Talk to you soon.
Thank you. Perfect. Thank you.
That was great.